As Americans, we cannot pretend that unusual activity inside our communities goes unnoticed. There comes a moment when silence stops being curiosity and becomes a refusal to acknowledge what may be unfolding beneath the surface. Behind the walls of a luxury townhouse in Lower Manhattan, officials discovered a series of irregularities that raised immediate questions about influence, hidden networks, and undisclosed operations connected to a widely respected public figure. Not a criminal hideout, not a gang safe house. The home of a man New York had long celebrated as a philanthropist, a man who appeared at cultural events, supported local schools, and spoke publicly about unity. His name was Liang Xiaomin, and until this morning, most people believed they understood who he was. At 5:41 a.m., while the city was still half asleep, authorized federal teams moved through the narrow sidewalks of Chinatown as part of a scheduled administrative review. Inside Liang's townhouse, the hallway lights flickered once before officials entered quietly. No shouting, no chaos, only the calm, deliberate movements of trained teams, examining a location tied to previously documented procedural inconsistencies. A portrait of Liang shaking hands with a mayoral candidate hung slightly crooked on the wall, its frame vibrating as tools were applied to what appeared to be a reinforced interior panel, disguised as a closet door. The panel gave way with a sharp crack, releasing a cloud of dust into the air. Behind it, investigators found materials, documents, and sealed containers that required further evaluation. Nearby, undeclared currency sat packaged in humidity-controlled units. Another compartment held restricted items that had not been properly documented according to administrative regulations. But none of it compared to what lay on a nightstand, Liang's unlocked phone, illuminated by a series of unread encrypted messages. The wording was coded, but the implications were unusual. Scheduling references, notes involving port activity, mentions of Green Dragon Lane and Red Orchid approvals, references to transit hubs in Xiamen, Long Beach, and Newark, and messages alluding to the Red Orchid Council, a fictional Chinese syndicate frequently referenced in academic studies analyzing transnational influence networks. The deeper officials moved through the home, the clearer it became that Liang's public persona represented only a fraction of a much larger structure. His office resembled a private coordination hub. Beneath the floorboards, a concealed server rack hummed quietly, its drives containing financial ledgers associated with a web of organizations, extending from Hong Kong to Vancouver to Brooklyn. Many of these entities appeared non-operational on paper, yet facilitated large transfers that now require formal review. Everywhere investigators looked, contradictions emerged. Children's thank you letters pinned beside unusual import documents. Award plaques mounted above blueprints of warehouse corridors. Photos of Liang attending community festivals above drawers filled with encrypted devices. The townhouse felt less like an ordinary residence and more like a carefully curated facade, one maintained so convincingly that few had questioned what lay beneath it. In Liang's study, officials discovered a sheet of rice paper on a lacquered desk, painted with 4 ink-brushed characters, Kaimen Zhou Huo. Open the door, let the fire pass through. Whether philosophical or instructional, no one could say. But as the review expanded, it became clear that Liang had built a network far more intricate than anyone had anticipated. If you are still listening, then you already recognize a truth many hesitate to confront. Influence does not always appear in obvious places. Sometimes it blends in, donates, supports, speaks politely, and gives the impression of unity. And when the mask finally shifts, the shock is not in what was found, but in who stood quietly behind it. Stay. What investigators uncovered next transformed a routine assessment into one of the most far-reaching administrative inquiries involving a foreign-linked shadow network that New York has encountered in years. The real story was only beginning. Federal analysts worked in silence as they reviewed the encrypted files recovered from Liang Xiaomin's systems. The deeper they examined the data, the clearer it became that his public reputation had only represented the most visible layer of a much broader structure. The community figure who sponsored cultural events, supported local programs, and presented himself as a philanthropic bridge between regions was only one facet of his operations. Beyond the surface, Liang appeared to be connected to a complex logistical and financial framework that stretched across international borders and interacted with multiple local institutions. He wasn't simply responding to opportunities. The pattern suggested he was coordinating them. Liang's network functioned through duplication and administrative mirroring. A well-known restaurant chain in Manhattan had a secondary branch registered in Vancouver that, according to records, had never opened for business. A warehouse in Flushing stored legitimate imports, while another location under the same corporate identity held only empty pallets and stacks of unused paperwork. Each company appeared to have an inactive counterpart, a twin entity that allowed funds and documents to shift between jurisdictions until the trail became nearly impossible to follow through ordinary oversight. One of the most unusual components was a midtown consultancy called Bright Meridian Solutions. On paper, it listed architectural assessments and design reviews as its core functions. In practice, investigators found that the office consisted of little more than a forwarding mailbox and a phone line rerouted to an unregistered device. Yet the company's accounts showed substantial annual transfers labeled as equipment evaluations and structural audit fees. Identical invoices emerged in Hong Kong and Los Angeles, revealing a chain that looked legitimate only to those who never examined it closely. What made Liang's operation effective was not its size, it was its precision. He understood the internal flow of New York's administrative machinery, the ports strained by high volume, the offices overwhelmed by paperwork, the departments where staffing turnover made oversight inconsistent. He mapped procedural gaps the way others map transportation routes. Busy inspectors could miss irregularities. Overloaded clerks could process documents without deeper review. And community donations made through legitimate nonprofit channels could help cultivate trust without raising immediate suspicion. Liang did not disrupt the system. He studied it and aligned it with his own pattern of activity. Analysts reviewing server logs found timestamps that matched port activity in Newark, Long Beach, and Seattle. Whenever a container from Xiamen changed status from pending to cleared, Liang's internal dashboard updated almost immediately. Some shipments moved through ordinary processing unusually quickly. One labeled as ceramic kitchenware advanced in a time frame that stood out during the review. Another marked as printed textiles moved forward without receiving the standard secondary check. Personnel records showed repetition. The same supervisors, the same clerks, the same shifts approving these entries with consistent timing. And then there was Green Dragon Lane, a coded term appearing repeatedly in Liang's communications. At first, analysts assumed it referenced a location, but deeper review revealed something different. Green Dragon Lane appeared to describe a predictable sequence of administrative pathways within port operations, routes with statistically lower oversight due to workload patterns and staff rotations. When shipments were funneled through these low-risk windows, they encountered minimal scrutiny. It wasn't a street or facility, it was a structural vulnerability, a gap in the city's administrative bloodstream. One message captured the pattern clearly: lane open, advance. It arrived 1 hour before a vessel from Xiamen docked in Newark. Cross-referenced records showed that 3 containers linked to one of Liang's companies were processed during that window. All 3 advanced quickly. All 3 were routed to the same logistics site in Brooklyn, and all 3 were empty when officials reviewed them, suggesting these shipments were being used for document movement or other non-standard purposes rather than routine commercial cargo. Financial reviews showed a similar pattern. Liang's nonprofits received significant contributions from overseas cultural partners, which were distributed to community groups as grants. But a portion of these funds later reappeared in inactive overseas entities through consulting reimbursements. It wasn't illegal in isolation, but it suggested a circular flow designed to recycle influence and resources behind a philanthropic facade. Perhaps the most concerning discovery involved a digital notebook hidden inside Liang's encrypted cloud storage. It contained only initials, dates, and financial entries. At first glance, it seemed ordinary, but when analysts compared the entries with city employee directories, unexpected patterns began to emerge, sharp and sudden like frost forming on glass. A building inspector whose family business expanded far beyond what his salary suggested. A zoning clerk whose long-standing debts disappeared with surprising speed. A port supervisor whose child received an unexplained educational grant. These individuals were not criminals. They were ordinary employees who appeared, in small, subtle ways, to have been drawn into a pattern of quiet, indirect favors. Nothing overt, nothing dramatic, just routine gestures that, over time, created small access points into the city's administrative processes. Liang did not rely on pressure. He relied on timing. He offered assistance where systems were overwhelmed. He provided support where oversight was thin. And with every small gesture, he gained something far more strategic in return: access. If you are still watching, then you understand the scale. This was not a hidden criminal underworld. It was a parallel administrative ecosystem woven quietly beneath New York's daily operations. A structure that used timing, procedural gaps, logistics, and human vulnerability to remain invisible for years. And soon, the federal response would match the scale of what officials believed Liang had built. The city had no idea what was coming next. At dawn, on a cold Wednesday morning, New York felt unnaturally still, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Streets were quiet. The river lay unmoving. And then, slowly, unmarked vehicles rolled out from secure federal facilities across Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Newark. For weeks, analysts had dissected the inconsistencies tied to Liang's network: duplicated shipping records, mismatched documentation, and warehouses registered to companies that existed only on paper. By the time the sun touched the skyline, one conclusion had become unavoidable. Liang had not simply taken advantage of weak points in the system. He had constructed a hidden framework beneath it, and now that framework was about to be examined in full. Operation Cross Harbor began at 6:02 a.m. It was not a raid. It was a synchronized administrative sweep, a coordinated effort across boroughs and state lines, designed to freeze the entire network in place before it could shift or disappear. In Queens, officials approached a seafood distribution warehouse that had been under review for weeks. Workers moved quickly, loading unmarked crates into a white panel truck. The speed of their movements suggested they anticipated an inspection, but they were not fast enough. A drone hovered overhead, documenting every angle. The moment the loading bay opened, federal teams advanced. Flashlights cut through the cold air. Workers scattered across the slick concrete floor, slipping on melting ice. One attempted to run through a side corridor, but was stopped by security personnel before reaching the street. Inside the warehouse, inspectors opened insulated compartments hidden beneath stacks of frozen goods. The compartments were empty, but had clearly been used recently. This location was not a storage facility. It appeared to be a transfer point, a node in Liang's larger logistical structure. Across the river in Brooklyn, the Navy Yard was already waking when a second team stepped inside a dull gray warehouse tucked behind a row of old freight offices. Conveyor belts were still running. Processing lines were still warm. Whoever had been there had left only minutes earlier. Boxes labeled as household supplies sat half-sealed on metal tables. Inside each one, investigators found ordinary goods neatly arranged over sealed packets bearing a red orchid emblem, the symbol of Liang's philanthropic foundation. It appeared to be a distribution line masked as everyday commerce, a place where branded community materials or specialty items were prepared for shipment. Everything looked normal, yet nothing aligned with what the facility was officially registered to handle. The largest escalation unfolded in Newark, at a private port facility frequently used by Horizon Path imports. The yard buzzed with early morning energy. Shipping containers stood stacked like steel towers. Forklifts beeped. Workers shouted instructions. Everything appeared routine until officials initiated their coordinated review. One forklift operator attempted to position his machine in front of a container being examined, obstructing access. He was quickly removed from the path by staff. Another worker disappeared between rows of trailers, slipping into the maze of metal corridors. Thermal imaging located him inside an empty container, his breath visible in the cold air when the doors opened. Inside the port office, irregularities became physical. A locked file cabinet contained handwritten notes that matched entries found in Liang's digital logs. Internal routing instructions, date-coded approvals, and a repeated phrase, "Jiao Min ensures clearance." The handwriting was neat, deliberate. It suggested someone confident that their process would never be scrutinized. By mid-morning, reports streamed into the Manhattan Command Center faster than analysts could process them. Multiple locations exhibited the same patterns: duplicate records, improperly filed documents, unexplained routing paths, and financial irregularities linked to overseas organizations. In a Flushing financial suite examined earlier that day, officials discovered a substantial amount of undeclared currency stored in concealed floor compartments. funds that should have been reported under standard regulations. But the most consequential discovery was not the money, nor the inconsistencies in facility operations. It was the paperwork. In Brooklyn, investigators uncovered a plain binder filled with monthly schedules, initials, departmental codes, and notes referencing routine administrative interactions. Dozens of public employees, some clerks, some supervisors, were listed with recurring entries labeled as partnership stipends or community grants. The binder did not expose a criminal plot. It mapped something far more systemic, a pattern of procedural shortcuts, informal cooperation, and unexamined habits that had allowed an external influence network to quietly align itself with the city's logistical processes. News of the coordinated reviews spread across the city within hours. Helicopters hovered above industrial zones, cameras zooming in on rooftops and fenced yards. Reporters rushed toward government buildings, seeking statements from officials who appeared blindsided by the scale of the inquiry. Parents walked their children to school past news vans, broadcasting updates about a man they once praised for his generosity. People watched in disbelief, realizing the systems they trusted had been quietly weakened long before anyone noticed. Inside Manhattan's field office, analysts cross-checked the binder's initials with personnel rosters. One by one, connections illuminated across the screen. Port supervisors, licensing clerks, inspectors, warehouse managers. The architecture of Liang's influence network was no longer hidden. It was now painfully visible. And at its center, woven through every unexplained approval and every unusual routing pattern, was Liang's signature. Operation Cross Harbor did not dismantle a criminal empire. It revealed something more unsettling, a structure built on complacency, administrative gaps, and the quiet assumption that someone like Liang could only ever be what he appeared to be. If you are still watching, then you understand. This was never about illicit goods or money. It was about the people who opened the doors, knowingly or unknowingly, and how easily trust can be reshaped when no one is looking. And now, with those doors open at last, New York was about to confront the true cost.